What I want to do today is share with you a little bit like how we actually came into existence, why we are very, very passionate about air quality, why we also started early on working in the educational area with like open source, open hardware. It's basically part of our DNA, I would say, as a company. And then in the second part, focus more into like indoor air quality and also the sensor build that we developed for people just to build their own sensors. Yeah, what Matt said, like anytime you have a question, just shout it out either through the chat or ask directly. I'm not sure if that's possible, Matt, but like I'm very open if there's anything within the presentation, like you can interrupt me at any time. And I'm more than happy to elaborate on these kind of things. Okay. Good. So I'm living in northern Thailand in the countryside, and every year they have a so-called smoke season. Okay, and basically this is how it looked like around 2 years ago. No, 3 years ago. Just opposite of my house. So this is actually taken from the terrace of my house. And you can see that the whole hill was burning. And that year was an extremely harsh smoking season, I would say. I have children going to the school nearby, and there was a lot of like anxiety with parents on, you know, how good is the air quality. But before we dive into this is also like 2 kilometers away. So it's like these kind of pictures that you see like in the US sometimes, in California, in Australia, I think 2 years ago. And unfortunately, I think with climate change, it becomes more and more often happening, yeah, these kind of wildfires. What is interesting is that we started then looking into basically the reasons for it, and also wanted to get more quantitative information. And what is not very well known, but I just wanted to highlight it here. There's actually from NASA, there's a satellite system that actually can detect these kind of wildfires. It's called FIRMS, and they also have a map online, and the link is up here. It's quite interesting. This was a few days ago when I prepared that presentation, and you can see all the wildfires basically around the world. Not much going on in the UK, but you can already see like in Thailand here, there's already fires at that time. And it's actually in the smoke season in March, April, it's getting a lot worse. This is how it looks. And if you then zoom in, that's around where I live, you can see each of these small dots actually represents a fire like this. So we are talking about hundreds of fires simultaneously creating a lot of smoke. And the effect that we are seeing here is basically this. This is from sensors that we started recording, I said, in 2019. And you can see that we talk about micrograms per cubic meter here, PM2.5. The new safe level, annual safe level that the WHO recommends, they just changed it a few weeks ago, is actually 5 micrograms. So we are talking about, these are our weeks, weeks in April that we have probably around nearly the 30 times the recommended health level. So it's a massive health issue that you to that extent not see anywhere in Europe, I believe, luckily. But I have also some data on the UK later on. So we also top the world with smoke on these days. So this is from AirVisual. They publish air quality data around the world. And you can say we were even worse than Delhi in India. So I mentioned it earlier. This is basically the reason why I was basically on a sabbatical at the time. where we really saw like how the school where our kids went or still going struggled. They have air purifiers in the classrooms, but with this massive impact, they were just not sure like what's actually the air quality inside the classrooms. Is it still safe? Is it better to keep the kids at home? Should the school close or not? And together with another parent who is an electrical engineer, we said, okay, let's just do something for the school. Let's just build some sensors basically. Write a small server program to receive the data and just to see like what's the situation in the school. And so very quickly we implemented this as a kind of prototype, but from the beginning looking at what are really specific challenges is that a school has. For example, making sense of a lot of rooms immediately, seeing on immediately what is the situation if you're monitoring like hundreds of rooms. So the first part of basically how AirGradient came into persistence was not as a company, just as a project to help our school basically. And then something interesting happened, because obviously it's not the only school facing that issue. And we talked to other schools, and our headmasters and teachers talked to our schools. So other schools actually came to us and said, hey, this is interesting. Can we also use this? And that's basically where this whole thing multiplied. And then at some point we said, okay, this might actually be the start of a company, basically. So that's how we came into existence. Before I talk a little bit more on what we do on the community side, just a little bit on the health impacts. So PM 2.5, what is very well known, I think, are things like, it can create asthma, in the long run, maybe also things like lung cancer, actually. But what's not so clear often is that it also actually linked to, like, for example, behavioral disorders, mental and motor development, especially if children at a young age are exposed to fine dust or PM 2.5. No? So I just want to highlight this. Yeah, and then, so interestingly, to prepare for this presentation here, I looked up a little bit, okay, what's actually the air pollution in the UK? Obviously, or luckily, it's better than what we have here, but it's still, if you look at the 5, they call it worst towns or cities in the UK, you can see that the highest in Warrington is like 14 micrograms per cubic meter annual average, and the new WHO guideline says the limit should be 5. Okay, before it was 10 micrograms, so they just reduced it to 5. And one of the reasons was that more and more scientific research came out, and there's a very strong indication now that actually for like fine dust, there's actually no really any safe level. So as lower the exposure, the better, basically. Okay, so the more you go towards 0, the more healthy you are, and there's a very clear link even on very low amounts of fine dust to basically life expectancy. So they could even, in the US, there are some studies where they compared actually really good areas in regards to air pollution to less good, but still very good areas of air pollution. And they could still see a difference in basically life expectancy in very low amounts of PM 2.5. So I also read, I'm coming from Germany originally, like in Germany now there are 270 cities that do not meet the WHO standards at the moment. So it's a massive problem, and it's something where hopefully governments and politicians will now, with this lower basically cap or recommendation of the WHO, do more to help us getting healthier air. So going back to Thailand, what are reasons of this massive smoke here? It's basically 3 things, and the first 2 are the most important ones. So like in Europe, I think 100 years ago, the farmers did the same thing. Like after the harvest, they just burned off their residuals, and that created a lot of smoke. Somehow they are still doing it here. And it's probably also really related to basically the money that the farmers have available on, plowing their fields. And the most unfortunate thing is the second one. So they're very expensive mushrooms growing in the forest here, and they are basically hidden under big leaves. And for the hunters and gatherers of these mushrooms to basically more easily find them, they just burn the leaves, and the mushrooms are pretty robust, so they are not getting impacted by the fire. So unfortunately, that's the number one reasons why we have that many hotspots, what you saw on the maps. And then in the bigger cities, also traffic is a big reason. So like emission standards are not as high as what we see in the Western world. So there's still a lot of like unhealthy, pollution created by cars, for example. So I mentioned it earlier. So we started with really this kind of focus on education, and one of the first things we also did was to really look at how can we actually create a long-term impact on improving the situation. So we started working with local high schools. So we built a network with our schools and local high schools, especially in areas that are most impacted by the fires. So living right like in the forest basically, and inviting the children for like a 2 days camp to our school, and then talk with experts on what's the health impacts. And we had firefighters on campus, basically explaining them how they try to extinguish the fires. We also try to develop more advocacy skills among the young people, because it's their future, and they are mostly impacted by it. Here is like a picture of one of the workshops where they discussed together like how they could maybe change the way they harvest things and reduce the smoke. Clean air for our future was like the main topic here in Thai as well, if you can read that. Then we also did a lot of other workshops. On the left, we started building air purifiers with children, just to also like not only have an air purifier, but also like look at, okay, how do they work? How much air you need to pump in. We measured CO2, PM, and on the right-hand side, we also started at this early stage already, like basically monitors together with children. And out of this was basically this AirGradient for education coming out, where at some point we said, okay, everything that we already do with the schools here, why not put it on our website, make an Arduino library, and like a PCB that people can, like freely download and produce to make their own air quality sensors. So I will go into that in a second. Here it is a little bit more. So what we measure is PM 2.5, CO2, temperature, humidity. It has a small display, and I also just now basically replaced this temperature sensor with a T-Box sensor to measure chemicals. And we will also dive into that. I know Matt is very happy on that. We will dive into that in a second. We also have a 3D enclosure, which looks like this, and I'm actually currently working with a very good designer on creating a new one, because this one, it kind of works, but it has the problem, for example, that the temperature sensor is very close to the PM sensor, that creates some heat. So we want to create a new enclosure that you can kind of have the temperature sensor a little bit external to just have more accurate measurements. So we always try to, learn from what we do and try to improve. Also, a lot of the things we do on our professional sensor, basically we can put this knowledge back into the open source, open hardware project. So from the data platform, obviously it's good to have a sensor. We have also the display on the sensor, so people can carry it around and make a very quick measurement. But especially if you want to improve your home, for example, it's important to have a lot of data and data that you can analyze in various ways. So we have basically different platforms. So we obviously have our own platform, which also works with our professional sensor, but you can also link the DIY sensor to that platform. And we're actually selling a kit which includes a 1-year subscription to the platform. On the other hand, it's all open source, open hardware, so you can send the data easily to anywhere you want. You can have your own server with a Raspberry Pi, for example, and I actually found out just recently that somebody created an integration to Home Assistant with ESP Home. So this has not been done by us, but it really shows that we have an active community behind, which I think is great. So there's a lot of choice on different data platforms. Then we also worked with kind of extension. This is more like experimental things that actually also came out of school projects here. So we have the possibility to have an external small display. So there's no sensor on this unit on the left directly, but it basically can pull the data from the cloud and then display sensors you might have in different rooms or outside and show you here, for example, the PM2.5 and US AQI and also CO2. On the right-hand side, this was a project we did with a kindergarten, actually. So, like the kids, if the air pollution is really bad, they should wear a mask against PM2.5. And so that was before COVID time. And we made a very small, this kind of lamp. That was actually an IKEA lamp. And then we repurposed it and put an RGB LED, which pulls the data from the platform and then shows the color. So if it's green, the air quality is good. If it turns red or purple, okay, you should wear a mask. So there are a lot of possibilities because it's an open platform to, do different kinds of things that you would like to do. I want to quickly dive in on what are our main products and services, especially because the kit also comes with a free 1-year subscription to the platform. And after this, we didn't really define the prices yet, but we want to keep it very, very affordable. So I want to just spend a few minutes here before we go on the indoor air pollution. So it basically consists of 3 things. So we have the platform, and most of the intelligence is really on the platform. So we try and keep our sensor as simple as possible, as robust as possible, as accurate as possible. But basically the main purpose of the sensor is to send accurate data to the platform. And then all the analytics and notifications and data handling happens on the platform. And then we also very early on made a very open API access. So we actually controlling ventilation equipment in schools with the system to have demand controlled ventilation. Our platform is also reset certified. Some people might know that it's an air quality standard that basically looks at how accurate is your sensor and basically your platform. So we went through many hardware iterations, and the interesting part is a lot of what we learned actually went into our open hardware sensor as well. And this is our latest generation, which we also now want to make available globally. And you see with an asterisk, these are basically our new sensors or sensor modules or metrics that we measure. So for a very, very long time, we really focused only on PM2.5, CO2, temperature, humidity. And the main reason was that we felt, okay, here we can really get very accurate measurements. With TVOX, it's a bit more tricky. I will come on that in the later part of that presentation. And then from talking with other people, and this might also be interesting for you, it's not only about air quality in the end. It's you want to have, let's say, a healthy environment. So we also start looking at noise and light levels. No? So, for example, noise. If you live, let's say, close to a big road, you might want to know, okay, what's your long-term exposure to noise, for example. So this is new things that we integrated in our latest generation, and we still kind of exploring what exactly we do with the data. But before you actually have the data, it's basically difficult to say exactly how to use it. So that's part of the latest generation. We also, and this is actually something you can also do with the DIY sensor with the kit. When I showed you this lamp that the kids built, so we also work with what we call traffic lights. It became very popular in COVID times now, that like in classrooms they want to know when they should open the windows and do the ventilation. So it's a typical traffic light. Here it's upside down. You have the red light at the bottom, but never mind. Yeah, very quick. I mentioned it very early on. It's because we started with schools, we actually had some unique challenges, which maybe people or companies that started more on the, let's say, measuring air quality in homes, for example, didn't really have so much. So one thing was, how can we very, very quickly get a good overview about the situation with many, many rooms? And then you have different responsibilities within an organization, and you want to make people accountable. So how can we group the rooms, for example, into different areas? No? And then also, like, how can we actually make alerts? You don't want to set up an alert for each single location. If you're like, we have schools with 200 sensors in there. So some way to effectively manage the system. So this is just a picture about our dashboard, and what you see here is that's a school that I think with around 80 sensors. You can immediately see what's the situation is. So you see on the left side, outside is moderate, so it's kind of okay. It just turned yellow. No? You see the school policy for that particular band, we call it the yellow band. No? Then you see inside PM2.5 is all green, average across all rooms. So this could be like 80 or 200 rooms, 1.1, which is extremely low. The reason is that this school has a very good purification system. And then on the right-hand side, you see the CO2. And obviously here you see, okay, it's actually not that green. So you have half the rooms. This was pasted in from another school on top of here, just to have a little bit different charts in there. But you can see half the rooms are actually orange and elevated there above 1,000 ppms. I will talk a little bit later also on what are good CO2 levels. So immediately, no matter how many sensors you have in place, you can actually see like what's the situation. And then you can scroll into all the different rooms, see what's the temperature, the CO2, PM2.5. We also look at heat index. We also calculate a COVID-19 index. So based on, I won't cover that today, but based on like CO2 levels primarily, but also looking at humidity and temperature, you can actually determine how likely is it that the virus survives in the air over a longer period of time. No? So we try to indicate this so that decision makers know, okay, this room is more at risk than another room, for example. And then obviously you have all these historical data. So here we also look at, we compared with the outside. So this is PM2.5, you can see outside the development and then inside. And we also highlight the close time. So if the school closes at like 3:30 and nobody's there, it's not really interesting, the data. So we gray it out, and then the school opens at 7:30 or something, and then it becomes colored again. So that immediately you can see what's the exposure during the daytime. Reports are very important. So we look at, especially over the longer period of time, like what are really rooms that have more problems and rooms that have less problems. And this allows you to identify how well does your air purification work, how well does your ventilation work when we look at CO2, for example. And this is the base to really step-by-step improve your school or your house, obviously, if you monitor at home. So this is one of our standard reports, for example, where you can see the last 3 days. You see first averages across groups of rooms. So here we separate junior school, senior school, common areas, kindergarten here. And then you can actually see each individual room. And what we also do, because we want to really improve, so we show the worst rooms first. This was during lockdown. So there are not really high CO2s except in the boarding and the fitness, because there were still like boarding students in the school using these facilities. No? By comparing it to the 2 previous days that the school was open, so you see that the weekend is missing here. You can really see, okay, is this an outlier? Was this just one day where it's particularly bad, or is this a room that has, you know, more fundamental issues? Yeah, I want to also highlight one thing which maybe isn't totally related to homes, but I think very important from what we learned is that there's a lot of concern about air quality. COVID made it much stronger because of indoor transmission of viruses. And what we see often is when we start monitoring schools, for example, that often the monitoring is the first step. So you want to collect data and see what's your baseline where you are. And some schools actually make that data available to parents and their staff. And often, even before you achieve very good air quality inside your school, for example, just by publishing that information, you actually gain a lot of trust. And that was something which initially surprised me, to just see that people often assume the worst, and then once you are open with your data and you share it, people are very grateful that you make this first step. So this was something that we really try and encourage schools, organizations to, you know, share their data, start measuring, even before they might have a perfect solution to improve the air in their specific environment. Yeah, so let's focus in a little bit more about CO2. I think that's interesting if you, yeah, like, you know, make your house more energy friendly. Matt mentioned it early on, like you are having basically a more airtight house. So if you don't look at the ventilation at the same time, obviously your CO2 levels increase. And some time ago, I looked at what are actually international standards on CO2, because it's not as clearly defined as with, for example, the PM 2.5, where we have the World Health Organization setting very, very clear guidelines. On CO2, it's more driven by national standards, but you can see here all around the world, we are looking at somewhere between, I would say, 800 and 1200, mostly ppm, that people say, okay, these are like CO2 levels that you should maintain or below. Those are maximum CO2 levels at this level. And then I want to share a little bit data now in this part. So this is from a classroom which has a demand-controlled ventilation system with the target to keep the CO2 levels below 800. So you can see during the daytime when the kids are in the classroom, obviously the CO2 levels rises, but they never go above 700. And then we also monitor schools that don't have any ventilation system. So this would be like a classroom. They don't open the windows. They don't have any, like HVAC system, and that looks like this. So we have a very, very different picture. And keep in mind that the recommended levels are basically around 1,000. Okay, so you can see that these classrooms basically within less than an hour, they get into unhealthy territory and then stay most of the time inside there. And with CO2, it's not that you have immediately harmful effects on your body like PM 2.5, but it really negatively impacts your cognitive decision making. So there are a lot of studies out there that starting from like 1,000 or 1,200 ppm, it really impacts your mental performance basically. So if you know this from, they call it meeting room syndrome, that you sit with a lot of people in a small room and at some point you're just getting tired, for example. And so this is just, it's not good for learning and decision making and especially creativity. So then let's look at houses. So we also measure CO2 in houses. So this is a typical development with 2 people over the night and in one bedroom. What you see here is that you start at around 400, which is the outside CO2 levels, and then once people get into the room, it just gradually increases. And here in this particular room, which is not totally airtight, it's a house in Thailand, and because of the climate here, you're not really built as airtight as in Europe. It kind of levels out at around 1,200. Then the same room with a ventilation, you see that you actually push it down by 400 ppm, and then it levels out at like around 800 to 900 ppm. So quite a difference. Same room, same occupancy, no ventilation, to ventilation. Okay. Obviously, it's better than the classroom where you have 20 kids inside, but it's still like good to have ventilation. So I want to talk a little bit about accuracy of sensors, to explain a little bit also like why we are choosing, I mentioned earlier, we started with PM 2.5 temperature emitted CO2, and then later on adding other things. So we basically put 4 sensors together and at the same spot, and then looked at the data. And what you see here is like CO2 levels. So this is like around little bit more than a week. And you can see that the CO2 levels correlate very, very well. So these are 4 different sensors. Most of the time, they are quite similar. Sometimes they have a little bit differences, but most of the time they correlate really well. If we look at the same picture for fine dust, which is a different sensor, for like PM 2.5, you see also quite a very strong correlation, but you can also see that some sensors, for example, the green one, seems to a bit more overestimating the peaks, especially, or in general a little bit higher. But you can also see they all come down to 0 if you have, for example, a purifier running in that room. No? So correlation is still very good. Now we did the same and looked for TVOC. Okay, and here you see a little bit of a different picture. So Yeah, and I want to highlight one thing I forgot this here. So the blue line here is basically the 5 micrograms that the World Health Organization says it's the safe level. So everything below here is basically considered as okay, acceptable, and everything above is unhealthy. And you can still see that most of the sensors at any time are either below or above the line. You know? Now, if we look at TVOC, recommendations are around 400 parts per billion. And here you see a very, very different picture. You see like a TVOC sensor that always like underestimates, still shows the peaks here and here, but totally different from, for example, the blue one, which reacts very, very dynamically to peaks, okay? And we saw this very early on when we started to experiment with the sensors like 3-4 years ago, that TVOCs are not giving as consistent results as the other sensors. And this is very important to keep in mind when you look at TVOC data, that they all basically detect the peaks. So you can see here's a peak, here's a peak, here's a peak. And we could also verify this. So we can actually trigger peaks by, you know, for example, opening a can of color or glue. Glue has a lot of like impact on TVOC, no? And then all the sensors react, but they react very, very differently. And you can see here from the safe level, like one sensor might still be from the absolute value and say, okay, this is actually still safe. And the blue one would be like 5 times above or more your safe level. What's also important on TVOC is it reacts to all kinds of chemicals. So it can be very, very harmful substances that, you know, can create cancer, and you shouldn't really expose to it. But they also react to, I would say, normal substances. So I can use, for example, sun cream that you put on your skin and put it next to a TVOC sensor, and it would also create a spike. So the problem with TVOC is also like you don't really know exactly what causes it. Is it something very harmful or maybe something less harmful? It just tells you, okay, there's something in the air, basically. There's also, I found this external post from, it's actually a programmer who, you know, had a problem with his home, and the same reason, like he made a low energy house, and then I think his wife didn't feel well, so he bought a sensor, and that sensor actually measured TVOCs, and then also often the TVOC sensor gives you an estimated CO2 value. It's a different technology than what we use, for example, in our sensor, also in a DIY sensor, which is using an infrared light and then really measuring the CO2. So what you see here is basically the same room, 3 sensors. I think there was a full board just relying on TVOC, and you can see that one is a total outlier. So you have 1100 ppm here and 1800 here, whereas the NDIR sensor, which we also use in our DIY kit and also in our professional sensors, are very, very close, maybe 1% compared to each other. So if you look at 434, 440, 439, this corresponds basically what we see here with also with our CO2 sensor. So you should always, like, if you do make CO2 measurements, go for an NDIR sensor and don't try to even they advertise it TVOC sensors that also give you an estimated CO2. They're just not reliable in my opinion. Okay. So this was like the reasons why it's not part of our, let's say, core offering, but we also still feel, okay, there's some value in TVOC. Okay, and that's basically when we experimented with TVOC and we had it all across our houses. Suddenly my partner said, oh, I have a spike. I don't know what's going on in that room. Okay, and then he went into the room, and his kids were actually playing with paint. Okay, so there is some value in it, but it's not in the absolute value. It's basically in the spikes and in this kind of relative to a baseline. So there's some value in it, but you have to be very, very careful what you make out of the data. And interestingly, if you look, one of the most famous company for sensors is Sensirion. They also, I think, have the best-selling TVOC sensor. And they're actually moving away from giving you absolute values. So their latest sensor generation basically gives you an index. So they don't give you parts per billion anymore, because I think they also recognize that this is very, very difficult to measure, and go more towards, okay, compared to a certain baseline, this is higher or lower, which I think makes a lot more sense. But nevertheless, I understood from Matt this could be of interest to you. So we actually, this is our DIY kit. So on the right-hand side, you see our standard temperature humidity sensor. And interestingly, there are also TVOC modules that fit the same slot. And they actually also have a module with TVOC, which is the same size like this one here, where I didn't have it on hand, which you can basically solder in and then change the software a little bit. And then instead of the temperature humidity, you can get your TVOC values, which I did down here. So this is from today's TVOC DIY sensor, basically giving you that data. The adjustments are pretty simple. So I mentioned it earlier, it's open source, open hardware. So you can install our standard library for AirGradient and then just add a library for like SGP30. That's the Sensirion TVOC sensor, which is, I think, most used in all devices if they measure TVOC. And then add a little bit of code, and you can basically get that data out of it. So it's not very difficult. I have the whole code here, so I will also publish it probably in our library. So if people want to do the TVOC thing. So that's about TVOC and measurement accuracy. I want to very quickly dive into a technology that we found here for really improving air quality, and that's what we call PPS, or positive pressure system. It's something that a lot of like low energy houses to some extent have, but there are also differences. So what positive pressure means is basically you take outside air, run it through high performance HEPA filters to really get rid of all the fine dust, and then push it into the house. But use basically, and that's the difference, often uses the special fan that can create pressure. So it's not so much about creating a massive airflow, it's creating pressure. So there are fans optimized for creating pressure and fans optimized for airflow. And then what you basically, and I'll show you data in a second, what you can actually do is you can create a situation where with the fresh and clean air pressurized house, you prevent dirty air from entering the house. So you always have, it's like a balloon with a small hole, you have always the air going out, so nothing can actually go into the balloon. No? And the interesting thing is here that you can actually decouple your outside air quality from the inside one. So in the past, often your indoor air quality correlates with outside, even if you have an air purifier running, but this one kind of decouples it completely. There are also disadvantages, obviously, especially in colder climates. They have units that do this with heat exchange, but because you always have to have a higher pressure inside, you cannot have your return air the same amount, so you always lose some, basically, energy through this temperature differentials. And what's really important here is like, which luckily you have it in low energy house, but you really need to make sure you don't have too many air gaps in the house. But I want to show you this picture here. So this is actually real life data that I did during a smoke season. You see the outside air is extremely unhealthy. So again, the World Health Organization safe level is at 5. So we talk about 30 times the safe level. It's what the US AQI calls hazardous. So it's an extremely unhealthy environment. And with a normal air purifier running, you can see the inside, you come down to maybe like 25 to 30%, but still unhealthy, still 10 times the World Health Organization. But if you switch off the purifier and basically use a passive pressure system, so you take the outside air, run it through the filters, and pressurize this room, you can see that you actually can come down to zero. So you're becoming independent from the outside air quality. And so this is a very, very effective solution. For example, if you live close to pollution sources and you want to create a very, let's say, healthy environment. And obviously also, like I didn't put the pictures in here, you also have the low CO2 then, because you take the outside fresh air with low CO2 levels and pump it into the room. So there are two advantages compared to the air purifiers. Yeah, I just wanted to present that technology a little bit, because I think a lot of low energy houses, they want to install ventilation. So I think the key message here is even in the UK, even in Europe, you have often not really healthy air from PM 2.5 point of view as well. So really think about adding a filter, not only getting your CO2 in, and maybe think about, like for example, how much pressure do you need to kind of decouple your house a little bit from like dirty air entering it, basically.